Professor Paskaleva works on the history and socio-political importance of Timurid architecture, and she has been in 2014. She was an associate of the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at Harvard, and until 2025, she was a researcher in the project Turks, Text and Territory, Imperial Ideology and Cultural Production in Central Eurasia, funded by the Dutch Research Council. I think even the titles of her major publication that Margalit just mentioned, like Silk Road Cities or Exchange Along the Silk Road, Urbanism, Landscape, Architecture, make it a perfect and obvious choice for giving a lecture in our Silk Road Forum, which this year is devoted to the theme of cities along the Silk Road. So I don't think we could have found anyone more fit for this lecture. And I also would like to thank Professor Paskaleva very much for coming to Israel in this situation, which this is not obvious at all. And there was, the lecture was supposed to be, I think, in April, in March, and was delayed because of this war, another war, or whatever campaign, or whatever problem of the Middle East. But we are very, very happy to have her here with us today, and she will speak about transforming urban patterns and pilgrimage route in post-Mongol Central Asia. So please, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this general introduction, and thank you very much for Professor Biran and Professor Gir Avni for introducing me to the Academy. Many thanks to my dear colleagues, Professor Michael Turner, Adi, for coming to this lecture, and for the very few students who chose to sit here this afternoon with the beautiful weather outside. So I'm going to talk about ongoing research. In the last 20 years of my life, I've spent traveling to Samarkand, studying Timurid architecture. And I must say that some of the photographs that I took 20 years ago are already archival material. So when I'm talking about transforming urban patterns, I will not necessarily going to focus only on the Timurid period, but I'll extend more or less until the present and show how these buildings and the city of Samarkand has been transformed in the last centuries, and how their architecture is still extremely relevant for our understanding of the complex interactions along the Silk Road. I chose two of the postcards from my collection to start this discussion. The first one says Poklony Samarkanda, which means a courtesy to Samarkand, a bow to Samarkand. And it underlines, the spiritual connectivity and the pilgrimage routes that Samarkand offered. And the other one is what contemporary academia would call a Desnification of Samarkand in the late 19th century, which says Privet is Samarkand, which means hello from Samarkand, as if Samarkand is a very popular tourist site that people expected to visit. So this change in attitudes from pilgrimage to tourism in the late 19th century is something that I want to talk about today. And I have a lot of visual materials. So if you would like to ask a question about a certain slide, or you have a question about what I'm saying, please feel free to raise your hand and ask your question. I don't mind being interrupted, but I'm really looking forward to engaging with you in a fruitful discussion about these ongoing transformations that have been taking place across Central Asia. Don't worry, I have only a few text-heavy slides, but I have to explain this at the very beginning. When we talk about architecture and representation of power, Guru Nijipoglu, one of the most famous scholars in the field of Islamic architecture, has formulated three major patterns of urban development across the Islamic world. And today, I would like to show you a fourth one that is extremely relevant for the urban setting architectural development, not necessarily only of pilgrimage routes, but of public architecture across Central Asia. So the first pattern that Guru Nijipoglu puts forward is the so-called palace-cum-mosque complex. And it was widely spread between the 7th and the 8th century, used by the Umayyads and the early Abbasids. In that period, the palace of government, the Dar al-Imara, formed a single unit with the congregational mosque. So the caliph had the function also of an imam. The prayer took place in the palace. That's 7th, 8th century. The following period, between the 9th and the 10th century, we're talking about sprawling extra-urban palatine complexes that are not necessarily attached to the congregational mosques. So they were implemented by the Abbasids, the Fatimids, and the Umayyads of Spain. And in that particular urban pattern, the caliphs had only role in the Friday prayer, and it was a ceremonial performance, a ritual performance, procession from the palace to the mosque. And we have examples of that in the cities of Samarra, in the Madinat al-Zahra, in the vicinity of Cordoba. The third pattern that Gulbur Njipurgu explains and puts forward is something that developed after the 11th century, and is also can be seen in Central Asia. So this is the citadel palace complex that was introduced by the Seljuks of Iran, Iraq, Anatolia. And these citadels were a very complex administrative and residential networks in which there were barracks, there were mosques, there were administrative buildings, and everything was taking place. The urban life of the ruler was taking place with this very enclosed citadel palace complex. Examples of that can be seen in the Ubaid citadel in Aleppo, the Mamluk citadel in Cairo, and in the Rum Seljuk citadels in Anatolia. So all these three patterns have to do with the role of the caliph, the role of the ruler, and their function as a religious ruler. The fourth pattern that I'm going to introduce today, the so-called Kosh ensemble, can be seen throughout Central Asia, starting from Anatolia and going to China. And the earliest examples that I'll show you are from the Karkhanid period in Samarkand. Kosh in Uzbek means eyebrows. So we're talking about pairing of two buildings that are situated on either side of an open space, usually a square. And the location and the scale of the kosh was the most important thing. An example of that, not the earliest example, I'm going to show early examples in Samarkand, but the most significant example of a kosh, of a pairing of two large buildings facing each other with their main entrances or portals symmetrically aligned along the same compositional longitudinal axis, is the Friday Congregational Mosque of Bibi Hanum that Timur erected opposite the royal madrasa of his Chingizid wife. So Timur, as you well know, was this ruler in Central Asia who was a Turk. So he didn't have any blood relationship with the Mongols. So he couldn't claim the title of a Khan. And that's why he married Chingizid princesses, two Chingizid wives. One of them, Saray Malik Hanum, and the other one, Tumam Akha. I'm going to talk about both of them and how the kosh was used as an architectural tool to strengthen Timur's position and to underline and stress this connectivity with the Chingizid family through architecture. So the largest mosque that was erected during Timur's rule, the Bibi Hanum Mosque, was built in a kosh across the square, across the street, to the madrasa commissioned by his Chingizid wives. So this is a representation of Timurid power that doesn't have a Chingizid lineage, but professes itself to the outside world as an inseparable part, as a complex, as a unity between the Timurids and the Chingizids in architectural terms. This is how the Bibi Hanum Mosque to your right and the remains of the Bibi Hanum Mausoleum look today. So this powerful monumentality can be still seen in contemporary Samarkand. Of course, the buildings have been drastically restored, and I'm going to show images of that. But the point is that the idea of the connectivity between the two, the Timurid and the Chingizid lineage, was professed in architectural urban terms at the Iron Gate of Samarkand, which was one of the most important gates along the Silk Road, because this is the way to Kashgar. Samarkand is a very old city, and I'm not going to dwell extensively on the history of the city, going back, hundreds of years ago. The three most important components in the urban fabric of Samarkand are Afroziab, which is the oldest part of the city, the Timurid city that emerged to the south in the late 14th century, and the Russian part of the city, the orthogonal city, that was introduced by General Konstantin von Kaufmann in the second half of the 19th century. Today, I'm going to focus on the Timurid city and explain how the pilgrimage routes of the early Timurids followed certain shrines and how pilgrimage took place in the late 14th century. Before I continue with the architectural data and with the buildings that I want to discuss, I want to mention 4 scholars that have played an enormous role in our understanding of the Timurid architecture, in our understanding of Samarkand. The first one is an archaeologist, Vyatkin, who translated some of the most important editions that describe pilgrimage routes in Samarkand, such as the Kandia and also the Samaria, pilgrimage text from 1835. The second scholar is Boris Zasipkin, who is probably the only architect that contributed to the proper restoration of Islamic architecture throughout Central Asia, not only in Samarkand. He lived on the sites. He worked with local masters. He created workshops employing local masters to transmit these, their knowledge and technologies of restoration throughout the early Soviet period. The other 2 scholars, who are a married couple, are the archaeologist and historian Michal and the architectural historian Galina Pugachenkova. Galina Pugachenkova is probably the most well-known architectural historian who published extensively on different periods of Central Asia, on the material culture, architecture, urban planning, landscaping, and her works have been translated in both English and French and other standard works that foreign scholars used when they start studying Central Asia. So if you're an architectural historian of Central Asia, you must have heard her name, Galina Pugachenkova. She had a very long and extremely prolific life. But I will show you how some also of her designs have influenced our understanding of Timurid architecture. So one of the most detailed plans that we have of Timurid Samarkand was created by the archaeologist Michal in 1942. So despite the start of the Second World War, Masson was working with was the director of the main archaeological commission in Samarkand since 1941, and he's been instrumental for our understanding of the Timurid city. His plan, this is from the National State Archive in Uzbekistan. This is the original plan before publication, made on rice paper, was later used by Golombek and Wilbur in their book on the architecture of the Timurid period. Today, I would like to go with you on a pilgrimage route following Masson's map. And we will start at the Timurid necropolis of Shahizilla, the living king. We'll continue to the Bibi Khanum Mosque, go to a building that doesn't exist anymore, proceed to the Ruhabad Mausoleum, and finish with Gur Mir. This pilgrimage route that starts in Afroziab and goes through the Timurid city, the Timurid citadel, and finishes here at one of the southern gates, was an actual pilgrimage route. And we know about that route from the pilgrimage guidebooks, the Samaria, that was used until the early 20th century. So people would really be encouraged, and it will be explained how exactly they have to walk, how many times they have to pray, where exactly they have to pray. So I'm following the Samaria in order to explain the walk that a regular pilgrimage will take. And I will start with the building that, as you can see from the slides, is not a Timurid building. This is the Hazrati Khizr Mosque, which what you see here was built in the 19th century. However, this building is probably the site, is the most important site in terms of Islamic architecture in Samarkand, because the first mosque in Samarkand, after the Arab conquest in 712, was erected on this place. And the position of the Hazrati Khizr, the green man, the green sage, who would leave those who believe in God, the religious people, in order to discover their inner connectivity with God. So this Hazrati Khizr, there are many legends, there are many myths related to the figure of Hazrati Khizr, not only in the Quran, but also in the Sufi thought. And the fact that Hazrati Khizr is associated with the stream, with the water of life, something that nourishes not only the belief in God, but something that nourishes the inner communication with God, is essential for understanding the pilgrimage routes in Samarkand, because all pilgrimage routes will start, even today, from the mosque of Hazrati Khizr. And the whole idea of Shah-e Zinda, the living king, that I'll explain in a second, also is related to Hazrati Khizr, because Hazrati Khizr led Qutham ibn Abbas, the founder of the Shah-e Zinda, into the well, and the living king, the name of Shah-e Zinda, is related to Hazrati Khizr, and the idea that nature is intricately connected to God's creation on earth. The mosque that was built by Qutayba in 712 was destroyed during the Mongol conquest. And this mosque, as I said, is from the second half of the 19th century. Also, the first Uzbek president, Islam Karimov, is buried to the side of the Hazrati Khizr Mosque, which makes it a major pilgrimage site for Uzbeks who go and pay their respect, to the first president nowadays. Shah-e Zinda, the living king, is the necropolis, which is on the same side of the road, as I said, the road to Kashgar, following the road from Hazrati Khizr. This Timurid necropolis is dedicated to Qutham ibn Abbas, a cousin of Prophet Muhammad, who was killed in Samarkand in the 7th century, the first decades of the Arab conquest. And it is believed that his head was severed, and he walked with his head under his arm and dove into a well, the water of life, Hazrati Khizr connection, and is still living today. So the living king, Shah-e Zinda, is related to the story of Qutham ibn Abbas. The necropolis, the way we see it today, has undergone enormous transformations, starting from the 11th century and continuing until the present. So I'm not going to discuss all the restorations and the epigraphic changes done throughout the necropolis. I'm only going to focus on two examples of kosh, of this pairing of buildings, and how they signify the importance of the location and the scale, and the person, or the ruler, or in this case, Qutham ibn Abbas, that is being paired with a royal element in order to underline the connectivity between royal power and religious power. So this is how, for those of you who have never been to Samarkand, this is how the necropolis looks like. It's a long uphill road. On each side, there are beautifully decorated one-chamber mausoleums. And it's still extremely popular pilgrimage site today. So the first part of the Shah-e Zinda necropolis developed under the Karkhanid period. And this is the first example of kosh, where we have a Karkhanid royal madrasa here to the left, paired with the very burial chamber of Qutham ibn Abbas, the main person who is buried in Shah-e Zinda, and the person for whom this necropolis is being created. So the proximity to Qutham ibn Abbas gives you baraka. So the closer you are buried to the body of Khutam Abbas, the more blessing you get. That's why there are so many mausoleums erected close to the actual burial chamber of Khutam Abbas. And the second example that I'm going to talk about is a Timurid example from the late 14th, early 15th century, in which the mosque and the mausoleum of Tumanakha, the second Chingizid wife of Timur, are aligned also with the mausoleum burial chamber of Khutam Abbas. Again, the architectural layout has been changed drastically since the first images we have of Shahrizinda that date back to the second half of the 19th century. The Royal Karhanid Madrasa was studied by an archaeologist, Nina Nemtseva, who discovered that the madrasa had a 4-in-1 structure, which means that it was a monumental edifice. And it was built exactly in the main axis of the burial chamber of Khutam Abbas. So the Karaghanid rulers of Samarkand erected their most important monument, Royal Madrasa, exactly opposite this chamber of the Holy Saint that is buried and celebrated at Shahrizinda. Also, the mosque, there was an additional mosque that stems from the Karhanid period, and the whole building, we have not only the cenotaph, which is in a gurkhane, in which people are not allowed to enter. So when the people go and pray, they pray in the ziyarat khane, where pilgrims are allowed to enter. And then below, we have Chilakhane, in which people can spend 40 days in prayer. So all this section of the Khutam Abbas monument, the mausoleum, was also erected in the Karhanid period, and it stems from the 11th century. So we have a pairing of a royal madrasa together with the mausoleum of a very important saint. And just to give you an idea, from the bird-eyed view, so this would be the Karhanid Madrasa, and later on Timurid mausoleums were built on top of it, and this is the Gurkhane of Khutam Abbas. In 2006, while Shahrizinda was being renovated, the main portal that had remained from a Karhanid Madrasa was demolished. So right now, we do not have any evidence of this Karhanid Madrasa apart from the drawings by Nina Nemtseva. Later on in the Timurid period, the Karhanid rooms were enlarged with a mosque that was erected by Ulugh Beg, who was Timur's grandson in the first half of the 15th century. And the Chartagh, so this is the third Chartagh. So there are 3 levels in Shahrizinda, and on the third one, we have these dome structures with 4 entrances. And the Chartagh here connects the corridor leading to the Ziyarat Khane of Khutam Abbas, and on the other side, we have the mosque of Tuman Akka. This is the restored version of the Chartagh. So here, pilgrims can enter, and then they come out on the other side. So this is an open kind of corridor where people and pilgrims roam freely. This is a cross-section and a plan of the Chartagh that is also from the Timurid period. So very consciously, the Timurid architects chose to erect the mosque of Tumanakha, who was a very young bride. So she was 12 when she married Timur. Timur, when he married Sarai Malik Khanum, the Chingizid princess, she was older than him, and they never had any children. So Tumanakha was 12 years old when she married Timur, the second Chingizid wife, and Timur never had any children with her. Although there is a kind of in the mausoleum, under the mausoleum, we have a burial ground. There is no burial. Nemtseva has been unable to detect any burials. It might be possible that this mausoleum that we associate with Tumanakha has been built for a child, a lost child, but we don't know about that. But there are no living children coming of the marriages, Timurid marriages with Chingizid princes. when one enters the Chertagh, on the one side are the doors, the beautifully carved doors, to the shrine complex of Kutam Abbas. And you see that not much has changed in the last decades. These are still in place, the original doors, which is not the case necessarily throughout Samarkand. And then we have this very lofty corridor that I'll show, a very similar corridor in a minute. And on the right, there is a Karaghanid minaret, which is the only Karaghanid minaret that has survived in Samarkand. And then, which again underlines the connection with the Karakhanids. And then one proceeds and enters the Ziyarat Khaneh of Kutam Im Abbas. That is, until the present, a very popular pilgrimage site. So this is the most sacred site in Samarkand, where pilgrims spent hours to pray and visit every time, they come to Samarkand. The actual cenotaph, the Gurkhaneh, where the presumed burial of Kutam Abbas would have been, is actually inaccessible for pilgrims. And this is the cenotaph from the 12th century, and the burial that was excavated by Nemtseva was also from the 12th century, so there is no evidence of burial from the 7th century or any evidence that such burial has ever taken place, which questions, the whole idea of Kutam Im Abbas, the main patron of Shakhizinda, buried there. However, the locality is what matters, the location is what matters, and the stories that are being told, and not necessarily in this particular case, the actual burial. Because of the importance of the site, Ulugh built this mosque in the first half of the 15th century. One of his sons also built the main portal to Shahizinde. The mosque reflects Timurid development, architectural developments in the first half of the 15th century, and is probably one of the most well-preserved mosques from the period across Central Asia. And the decoration with the dado and the white stucco walls is actually very similar to the decoration of another shrine that is far away from Samarkand, the Yasavi shrine, which is usually attributed to the late 14th century, but the similarities with this particular mosque are striking. So on the other side of the Chertagh, in a kosh, was the mosque of Tumanaka, this Chingizid princess. So this is the mosque, and from the mosque directly one can access the mausoleum with a crypt in which there is no burial. So it's a one-chamber mausoleum with a very high Timurid dome and a very high drum. This mosque was restored in 2005, and actually currently is used as a souvenir shop. So the pilgrims go inside and can buy trinkets, they can buy scarves, and continue their prayers at Shahizinde. The actual mausoleum of Tumanaka has undergone also drastic transformations in terms of its revetments, the decoration in tile mosaic. This was the first dome photograph that I have of from the Turkestan album from the second half of the 19th century. And you see how the revetments have been restored in decades of first Soviet restorations, and later on in 2005, 2006, local Uzbek restoration campaigns, in particular in Shahizinde. As a result of the restorations in Shahizinde, the French Research Institute was closed in Samarkand. So Shahizinde was this example where we have kosh between the Karakhanids and Kutam Im Abbas, and between the Timurids and Kutam Im Abbas. The next monument that the pilgrims would visit when entering already the Timurid city, just opposite the Hazrat Hizr Mosque through the Iron Gate, would have been the largest architectural ensemble of the Timurid Empire, built until that moment, late 14th century, the Bibi Khanum Mosque. Usually, when we talk about Timurid architecture, many of the Western scholars, but also Soviet scholars, associate Timurid monumentality. And always they give an example, the Bibi Khanum Mosque. I don't think that the Bibi Hanum Mosque was completed by Timur, simply because when he comes back from the Indian campaign at the end of the 14th century, he is so upset that the portal of the madrasa of his Chingizid wife is higher than the portal of his own mosque. And he commissions the total destruction of the portal. And it's recorded by Clavijo, one of the Spanish ambassadors, how he's throwing meat into the pit where the foundations are being laid. It was a very heavy winter in November 1404, and Timur dies in February 1405. So it's highly unlikely that Timur was involved in the completion of the Bibi Hanum Mosque. So the other examples that I'll show you today are actually of one-chamber mausoleums that I think were more typical and more characteristic of the actual building traditions under Timur. The Bibi Hanum Mosque, similar to major monumental projects across Samarkand, was most likely completed by Timur's grandson, Ulugh Beg, who ruled Samarkand for 40 years until 1449. But the mosque was situated in the most thriving bazaars of the city, the gate that leads to China. The bazaar, so the whole area from the gate until the entrance of the mosque was a huge bazaar. And all the merchants that would have entered this new Timurid city that started from the Iron Gate, just opposite the Hazrat Hijra Mosque, would have seen this as their first image of Timurid Samarkand. So that's why Hazrat Hijra was so important, because this was the place of the first mosque in Samarkand. And I've always wondered, why would Timur choose this gate in particular to lay the foundations of his most ambitious project? And I don't think the answer is to Shah-e-Zinda. I think the answer is to the positioning of the Hazrat Hijra Mosque and the traditions associated with Islam and Arab rule in Central Asia. So this is how this main trade street would have looked like at the end of the 19th century, still extremely popular and used by many merchants. The mosque, given its monumental scale, started collapsing more or less the very onset of its construction. Stones were falling down from the main dome, and it was abandoned. It was not used as a congregational mosque. And many of the building materials, because it was built with stone, were reused by local population. This is quite common in Central Asia, reusing building materials from abandoned or dilapidated buildings. That's why by the end of the 19th century, the building was in such a bad state of repair. And what is very interesting is that although the designs for the restoration of the Bibi Hanum Mosque were all created during the Soviet period, the actual construction started after independence in 1991, as you can see based on the dates of these photographs. So the mosque was restored with reinforced concrete and steel, and based on plans, elevations that have never been proven. Also, the layout of the mosque was changed. The size or the monumentality of its portals were created not necessarily based on actual measurements, but based on the sketches and drawings developed by Soviet architectural historians. And in these sketches and drawings, they were deriving inspiration from Iran, because Iran was the place of other examples of Timurid architecture, in which you have these monumental portals with very high minarets. But we don't know, we simply don't have any visual information in order to prove that the Bibi Hanum Mosque looked like this in its original state. Something else that was used were Greek approaches to symmetry. The golden section was introduced by Soviet restorers in order to show that this architecture of Central Asia was way more related with Greek, with European geometrical measurements, rather than with local creativity or with local standards. And this was done in order to stress the connectivity, the potential that Central Asian elite had in order to be cultured and developed and not to remain in this more barbaric, backward understanding of what Islamic architecture stood for. So what we see nowadays, the Bibi Hanum Mosque, is actually a product of this Soviet understanding of Islamic architecture. But there is something way more important, I think, to the Bibi Hanum Mosque that has nothing to do with the Soviet restorers. It's the connection of the mosque, this most monumental example of Timurid architecture, to Ilkhanid Iran. So the Ilkhans were ruled until 1335. So Abu Sa'id, the last Ilkhan, dies in 1335. Timur is presumably born in 1336 and is seen as this successor to the Ilkhans. However, it is Ulugh Beg, Timur's grandson, who was born in Sultaniya, who spent the first 7 years of his life in the Urdu of the main Chingizid wife of Timur, Sarai Malik Khanum. So Ulugh Beg and the monumentality that Ulugh Beg introduces to Samarkand during his 40-year reign doesn't stem from the examples from Samarkand. It stems, I think, from these images that he saw in Sultaniya. Sultaniya was the capital that was, Ilkhanid capital that was built by Uljaitu. And here it is depicted by the Ottoman geographer Matrakchi, in which we see the monumental mausoleum of Uljaitu, the mosque that was paired in a kosh with the madrasa of his favorite wife, and the mausoleum, the tomb of Barak Baba. So what is very characteristic of this mosque, and we have drawings, reproductions of the mosque, and descriptions as early as the 17th century, is that the main dome sanctuary was behind the one that led to the main congregational mosque. So this example comes from Varamin, which is the first Ilkhanid mosque that has this dome sanctuary along the main longitudinal axis. And that was exactly repeated in the Bibi Khanum Mosque in Samarkand. We have a major monumental entrance portal and a monumental entrance to the main sanctuary with the domed chamber behind it. Even the treatment of the side revetments of this entrance portal can be associated with the polygonality of the revetments of the Mosque of Uljaitu. And the pairing of the kosh, of which we don't have any visual evidence, was a fact and was described by Matrakchi in his depiction of Sultaniya. So what we have at the Bibi Khanum Mosque, we have exactly a pairing with a madrasa of a chief wife, and we have the monumentality of a mosque that repeats more or less the Mosque of Uljaitu in Sultaniya, the Friday Mosque. Another very important component, which was put forward by Sheila Blair, a very famous architectural historian, is the number of minarets in Uljaitu's mausoleum. There are 8 minarets. And Sheila Blair asserts that 4 minarets stand for Mecca, 4 minarets for Medina, and the combination of 8 minarets is a symbol of the assertion of the ruler as the ruler over the entire Islamic world. So these 8 minarets in Uljaitu's mausoleum signify that Uljaitu wants to be seen as the ruler of the whole Islamic world. Well, if you count this, the number of minarets in the reconstruction of the Bibi Khanum Mosque, 4 on each corner and 4 on the main portal and the sanctuary portal, we will also have 8 minarets. So whether there is a direct connection with Uljaitu Sultaniya, we don't know. But still, the number of minarets is there. Something happened here with my slides. I apologize for that. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Okay, so the pairing of the Bibi Khanum Mosque and the remaining, what is now is remained from the madrasa, is only this mausoleum of Bibi Khanum, may have been copied from these patterns in Sultaniya. Unfortunately, the Bibi Khanum mausoleum that has remained as the only element surviving from the Bibi Khanum madrasa has been extremely damaged. But it contains some of the most intricate Timurid decoration, which actually puts it in a timeline way after Timur in around the 1430s. But that's a different topic. So I just want to make the bridge between the royal patronage and the connectivity with the Ilkhans from within the aspect of Sufism, because the other 3 monuments that I want to show you in the remaining minutes are all mausoleums that were dedicated to Sufi saints. So in this Ilkhanid period that I just discussed, Sultaniya, there were 3 dominant Sufi orders: the Suhrawardiya, the Kubrawiyya, and the Naqshbandiya. I would like to explain something about the Suhrawardiya Sufi order that was popular in Western Persia, and it was founded by the Sufi Sheikh Suhawardi. And one of the most famous followers was the Persian poet Sadi. But this Sufi order was known for their close relation with the political rulers and the acceptance of endowments from the state. So two of the mausoleums, the first two mausoleums that Timur built in commissions during his reign in Samarkand belonged to Suhawardi sheikhs. The most important, Sufi order in Central Asia, the Naqshbandiya, where we think it's also intimately related, to the Timurid family, actually emerges much later, and with the figure of Hoja Ahrar, the most famous patron in Samarkand, develops to a completely different network of Sufi network with incredible wealth. But for the time being, I just want to stress that during and after the Ilkhanid period, we have very close relations between the royal family and the ruling family, in which Sufi masters are the main agents and beneficiaries, in a way, of the Mongol conversion to Islam, and the Mongol rulers of Berke and also Kazan Khan convert under the supervision also of Sufi masters. So Sufism is a very important religious element in the development of Islam across Central Asia, gains also such prominence that we start seeing mausoleums that are not indigenous to the Sufi kind of prescription of burial practice, but these mausoleums start to be built as exclusively as royal buildings across the major capitals of Central Asia. So one of the first mausoleums of the Timurid period we have in Samarkand is actually built in the citadel here, the Timurid citadel, and it's dedicated to Nur al-Din Basir, who was a Suhawardi sheikh, and his name also he is known as Qutb Chahar the Home. So this means the 14th pole or the 14th axis, and this is related to the idea that divine order is sustained by axis, and this is the spiritual axis upon which the entire universe revolves. So this Sufi sheikh is seen as the pillar that is also related to the perfect man who mirrors God's creation. So there is a lot of symbolism in the figure of Nur al-Din Basir. And his main mausoleum, there is a reburial, is erected by Timur as part of the citadel in the late 14th century. The description and the pilgrimage to the mausoleum is described in detail by a pilgrimage manual called Samaria that is written by Abu Tahir Hoja in 1835-36. And unfortunately, all these detailed plans that you see here were published by after the Russian conquest of Central Asia, before the mausoleum was destroyed by General Konstantin von Kaufmann in 1880, because the museum was exactly along the wall of the citadel. And when the Russians came to Central Asia, they had to expand the citadel, and they needed the space. So this first Timurid mausoleum was completely blown up in 2 attempts. And all we have as remains of the mausoleum are these drawings and Vereshchagin painting that is based actually on an original photograph taken during the Russian conquest of Central Asia. The mausoleum could be seen also from the Registan Square, which was the main trading place in Samarkand. From the mausoleum of Nur al-Din Basir, the pilgrims will proceed to another Sufi Suhawardi mausoleum, a so-called Ruhabat, and from there they will continue to Guremir, to the Timurid dynastic mausoleum. So this will be actually a Sufi pilgrimage commemorating Suhawardi sheikhs, starting from the main mosque and continuing to these one-chamber mausoleums. So the mausoleum of Ruhabat, Ruhabat means the abode of the soul, another metaphor for the sheikh that was buried there, belonged to Burhan al-Din Saharji, who was a 14th century Suhawardi sheikh, and according to legend, he dies in China, but the body is transported to Samarkand, and he is buried, so to speak, in the feet, of his Sufi master Nuruddin Basir. And then exactly the same kind of patronage buried in the feet of a Sufi sheikh appears also in the Timurid dynastic mausoleum of Gur Emir, which is situated a couple of 100 meters from the main entrance to Ruhabat. So these three mausoleums, Nuruddin Basir, Ruhabat, and Gur Emir, would have been in a direct pilgrimage line starting from the main gate, the Iron Gate of the Timurid city. The area around the mausoleum, later on in the 19th century, was used for a bazaar or for trading wood, because this was the potter's area. There were many potter craftsmen living around Gur Emir. And Gur Emir is this Timurid dynastic mausoleum that has been studied very well and is very well documented. I'm going to show you a few examples of undocumented mausoleums that are part of Gur Emir. And we don't really know who was buried there, simply because during the Soviet restorations, these burials have been totally transformed. So potentially, these would have been burials that were part of the pilgrimage route. So when I talk about transforming pilgrimage routes, I not only mean the recreating of new pilgrimage routes after the Mongol conquest by the Timurids, but I also mean recreating pilgrimage routes, changing pilgrimage routes, also as a result of restorations and drastic transformations of this urban space of the mausoleum complex. Even today, Gur Emir is a very popular pilgrimage site. And what we see actually, the main mausoleum has been created in a series of building campaigns and was not created simply by one ruler, but by several rulers, and also has been studied by different scholars that have all added in a way and made their own contribution to the history of the site. The complex we see, and as we speak, there are actually excavations here next to this corner, which is the Hanka, consists of a Sufi Hanka and a madrasa. Later on, we have the mausoleum, and most likely, also during the reign of Ulugh Beg, there is a larger Sufi Hanka erected to the south with a major dome space that hasn't remained, and we have only the western Iwan. This is this structure. But there are also several mausoleums that I would like to show you that haven't been properly studied and have to be properly studied. So this plan is very much unknown. So this was developed as part of a study by Pletnev. That was his PhD dissertation. And the archaeologists excavated parts of the northern and southern Iwans at Gur Emir, but it was very difficult to conduct these excavations because the mausoleum was very much embedded into the local houses surrounding the area, the Potter's Quarter. But Pugachenkova only here in an archival kind of piece from her own archive publishes this extended plan of Gur Emir with a Sufi Hanka. And this is the plan that I found at the Architectural Archive in Tashkent, in which clearly we see this larger dome that was supposed to be erected above the Hanka. So the Sufi element, although this is already a dynastic mausoleum, and we have Timur, Muhammad Sultan, we have Shehruh that is buried here, Ulugh Beg developed, so this was all created under the reign of Ulugh Beg until 40-49. He designs a mausoleum that is very much looking like the Ahmadiyya Savi shrine in Turkestan, which is the largest Timurid Sufi mausoleum known today. Apart from the burials of the male representatives of the Timurid family that are into the crypt of the mausoleum, we have other cases of different mausoleums that, as I said, haven't been properly studied. And this mausoleum was opened in 1941 by Stalin in order to prove that the Timurids were really buried there. And Gerasimov created these images of the Timurid rulers based on the exhumed bones. So this is Ulugh Beg. The previous one was Timur. But I want to show now in the last remaining minutes these two mausoleums. So this mausoleum was recently opened. It can be accessed from the main courtyard at Gur Emir. And all these cenotaphs that are attributed to male members of the Timurid family in the second half of the 15th century might have been buried in the madrasa or other parts of the compound, other parts of the complex. But they're all put together, I think, in a relatively random order. The thing about this mausoleum is that before that, during the Soviet restorations, it was used as a storage space. What is very interesting, that this is the structure, this is where the mausoleums now can be entered from the main courtyard. But there is a second floor. There is another mausoleum on top of this. And I discovered that in the plans actually in the National State Archive. And I asked one of the guards to open the side entrance from the main Iwan. And this high corridor is very reminiscent to a corridor in the Yesevi Shrine, in the big Aksaray, and to the corridor in the Ulughbek Madrasa in Samarkand. It might be possible that this is the staircase that leads to the second floor of this mausoleum. And this is the dome space that is still untouched today, that can be seen simply behind this main entrance, the main facade at Gur Emir. This is the space on the second floor, and you can clearly see that it has been added to the main octagon of Gur Emir. Masson attributes the main arch, to the 17th century, but the Sipkin proves that actually this part of the mausoleum was built during the reign of Ulughbek. And it might be possible that this space here on the second floor might have been used as a library, might have been used for other purposes, and the edifice below, the ground floor, was used as a mausoleum. But this hasn't been described in any of the literature I've been able to find on Gur Emir. The other point is here the southern part of the mausoleum, which contains another structure that may have been built during the reign of Ulughbek, most likely his own mausoleum. So it is quite possible that Ulughbek, during his long reign in Samarkand, apart from the extension of Gur Emir with this Khanka major hall, may have constructed also his own mausoleum here. And this is how the mausoleum is connected, or its position of the mausoleum behind the octagon. And here the position of the mausoleum based on the plan of the whole structure. And this is the plan of the mausoleum, where the body would have been entered here. This is a dome space. And then this will be, from this ramp, this would have been the actual mausoleum. Unfortunately, nowadays, the mausoleum is used as a souvenir shop. It was discovered in 1957 by Shakurin, but there have been no study, apart from this only article by Shakurin, who was actually supposed to be interred in this additional mausoleum as part of Gur Emir. Also, next to the mausoleum is this Ulughbek gallery that was also described by Pugachenkova and by all Western scholars as belonging to the first 20 years of Ulughbek's rule. It was completely rebuilt in 1943, and this is how it looks today. So the pilgrimage aspect of Gur Emir, as a result of the transformation of these mausoleums and the repositioning, of the cenotaphs, I think has been also transformed in the course of the last 150 years, or perhaps earlier. We have very limited evidence, about the pilgrimage actually route within the mausoleum, because most of the narratives from the 16th, 17th century concern the madrasa of Muhammad Sultan that was active until the 17th century. But what happened exactly here and how the pilgrims moved within the complex is still something that needs to be described. As a final point, I want to raise the fact that we don't have any existing Waqf documents about the actual mausoleum prop of Gur Emir. In Gazorga, another building that the Timurids erected, a mausoleum that was erected in Herat, we have the Waqf that is on the main entrance facade of the monument. It might be possible that there was a Waqf here on the walls of Gur Emir, but we would never know, simply because this whole courtyard facade that remained until the 1950s, was completely rebuilt. And it was rebuilt based by a drawing, by a sketch. Simply sketches were being used to reconstruct this original Timurid heritage, in which the main entrance to the Ulugh Gallery was completely removed. You see here, there is no entrance whatsoever. And the sketches concerned not only the reconstruction of the building or the main courtyard, but the whole surroundings in this very European landscaping attempts to create geometrical gardens that were totally out of context, in Central Asia, where the Charbagh, the fourfold garden, would be most popular. So what we see today, this wall, the central courtyard facade at Guremir, was actually built in the late 1940s and was erected in front of the main octagon that may have contained some actual evidence about the history of the mausoleum. The main also entrance portal here, what we see nowadays, was also built without any evidence about its height in the late 1940s, and the corner here, the corner side, was also erected. These corners are very important because they might connect Guremir to other projects of the Timurid royal architect in Herat. This is the main entrance to the Ulugh Gallery, and this is the only text that actually here, epigraphy, that connects Guremir to Timur, to the main patron that is buried there. And you see the poor condition in which this text was in the late 1940s. The main portal to the west was also strengthened, and this is, I think, when this entrance to the second floor and to the additional mausoleum had been lost and hadn't been properly studied because of the building campaign that might have changed here the layout of pilgrims, or the layout, how people walked within the mausoleum. So this is the Guremir today. This is the main entrance to the Ulugh Gallery, and this is the main entrance to this small mausoleum that I showed you with the different cenotaphs that may have been collected from the madrasa or from cenotaphs in other parts across the complex. And the architectural historians, here we have Zasipkin, Soviet architectural historians who worked very closely with local masters, were absolutely essential for preserving at least what we have today of Guremir. And these local masters were celebrated as heroes of socialist labor during the Soviet period. But Zasipkin was the only one who asked for their advice and actively engaged them in restoring the heritage, not only in Samarkand, but also in Bukhara. And all their efforts were supervised by the secretary of the Siop Raikom of the Uzbek Communist Party, Tavarish Unimov, and we have documents of that because he was monitoring the work of Zasipkin, and after the restoration of the dome was completed, he gave him a very low score. So Zasipkin, albeit all his efforts, couldn't meet up the expectation, of the secretary of the Raikom. Apart from all this, and apart from all the stories and the restorations and the destructions and the restructuring of pilgrimage routes, Samarkand, and in particular Guremir, remains to this day a very active pilgrimage site, very popular among local pilgrims that are coming not only from Samarkand or the vicinity of Samarkand, but are coming from all over Uzbekistan. And this pilgrimage is completely different, from the tourists that go there constantly and are actually affecting, the structure of this very fragile mausoleum. But I think that the power of the architecture is essential, for understanding why people still can associate their own experience with Samarkand, with the saints, that were buried in Samarkand, because the architecture makes it palpable. They have something to go and visit, regardless of the restoration campaign. Well, I've been studying Timurid architecture for such a long time. I really finally came to the conclusion that yes, I can describe the process of restorations. I can show all these documentation that I found in the archives, but it doesn't change, the attitude of these pilgrims. It doesn't change at all their understanding, because it's the visiting the site, the visitation, the ziyarat that they're doing that is the most important thing for them. Thank you. There were no questions? Yeah, okay. There are no questions.
All right. So first, I wish to thank you for your fascinating presentation, and well, makes one wants to visit Samarkand finally. I have a question about the structure of the Uzbek Kush complex. Can you please show the slide with Bibi Khanum, seen from the side?
This one?
Next
Just
one?
the computer
Never mind.
is a bit. Yeah, I see it here on my screen, but it needs some time. Okay, I will.
No.
This one? Oh, it's.
All right. So.
Yes, but you can ask a question.
Okay. I was wondering about both the spatial aspect and the dual aspect. So I've been wondering if the dual aspect was particularly attractive to the Timurids, considering their dual identity as constructing themselves as Gurgans and Amirs in respect to the Chinggisid puppet Khans. And on the other hand, I was thinking about the special, the septual aspect of, the meaning of power, enabling a specific ruler to appropriate such huge place in the very crowded, I imagine, Muslim city, and to clear it off to be able to create this open space, highlighting the connection between the two adjacent complexes, two adjacent buildings.
Thank you very much for the question. So, first of all, in order to build the Bibi Khanum Mosque, indeed the most monumental edifice in Samarkand, Timur, and there are records of that, had to destroy larger parts of the city, where the citizens started complaining, that he was doing this without their permission, but yet he continued in order to clear the site. And the madrasa of Sarai Malik Khanum would have been standing by that point. So the location was, I think, determined by two factors: the proximity to the Hazrati Khizr Mosque, this first mosque that was erected in Samarkand, that was very well known by even after so many years after the Arab conquest, and the connectivity with the, as I explained, with the Chinggisid family. Timur would have definitely had a say in choosing the location. Whether he had a direct say in the actual erection of the building, I'm not sure about that, simply because he died, as I explained, a few months after the construction of the main portal had started. What we do know is that we have, so I've published an article about that on the Bibi Khanum Mosque. There is, the mosque was so well known that we have records of the mosque in the Ming Chronicles. So they describe the monumentality of the mosque, the type of stone that was used. There was a Quranic stand that I didn't show here because simply this lecture is very short. And the only thing they get wrong, the Ming Chronicles, is the actual position of the mosque. But if you look from the citadel, that would have made sense. So this mosque was not created only to impress the people in Samarkand or those visitors coming from the road to Kashgar. Or the people that are visiting the bazaar. This mosque was built to impress with its monumentality. This mosque was built to impress with its monumentality. Also, the Ming China, the dynasties outside of the Timurid realm. And that's why I think its locality is so important. We don't know, the plan that you see here to the left was created in the 1950s. To be honest, we don't really know what was exactly the outline of the Bibi Khanum Madrasa, because it falls very much within the wall of the Timurid city. And it would have been a very strange choice of place to erect this madrasa in the first place. But as I explained, the proximity to the Hazrati Hijri Mosque and to Shahi-Zinda might have been the main reason for choosing this locality. And this is also the place from which the Timurid city starts growing from Afrosia up to the south. The Iron Gate. So that's the borderline where Afrosia finishes and the Timurids start building. And I think that it's a combination of factors. It's the Chingizid connectivity, the lineage with the Chingizids that's not there, but is staged in a way through this architecture. It's the monumentality that probably was not there exactly during the reign of Timur, but is later on very well known and documented in sources that would, at least I'm not aware of them writing about any other building in Samarkand. So this was created to leave a lasting impression, and that impression was definitely connected to the Chingizids.
Yes, as Timur had said to Ibn Khaldun visiting him in Damascus, Ibn Khaldun addressing him as the Khan, and then he declares that he is only the Emir. Right. Thank you so much for your response.
Welcome. Yep.
Thank you very much. It was edifying and beautiful images. I'd like to go back to the page with a lot of words, a lot of text about the Sufis.
Hope this will work.
Yeah, I think the Sufis, as you said, major agents of Islamization. It's a small point, and
yeah.
I don't think it interferes with your main thesis. But I really have to say I contest the idea of main agents and beneficiaries of Mongols' conversion to Islam at this period. Maybe we're reading back at a time when Sufis were really much more important. I'm not saying they weren't. They had no role to play here, but I'm not at all convinced that they were main agents and beneficiaries of the Mongols' conversion. And in fact, if you mention here that he was the Sheikh Sadr ad-Din Ibrahim Hamuya, the same Arabic text that describes his big role is actually as the man who actually converted him, but he was convinced by his number one commander Nauruz. It says it very specifically, and if I remember correctly, his aunt. Okay, so Turks and Mongols who are already converted are converting other Turks and Mongols. The Mongols were surrounded by not only Sufis, they were surrounded by ulama, and they were surrounded by officials and bureaucrats who are very, very learned too. So I would think it's just part of the deal, part of this process were the Sufi masters. And again, I would think that perhaps the more important role perhaps of the Sufis later on influences people like Hodgson writing succeeded in combining a spiritual elitism with social populism, etc. As I see it.
Thank you very much for this comment. I think that in the case of Samarkand, because we have only these existing mausoleums that were directly related to Sufi sheikhs, we have so the Timurid family comes from Shahrizabs, the Barlas tribe. And in Shahrizabs, we have the mausoleum of Sheikh Hulal, who was a Naqshbandiya. And this kind of connectivity between the Timurids as newly emerging kind of political power, being supported by the Sufi sheikhs, or having the mandate, the religious mandate that is also associated with the Sufi sheikhs, I think, starts from Shahrizabs. It doesn't start from Samarkand. But in Samarkand, also in Gur Emir, Timur is buried, or claims that he wants to be buried, at the feet of another Sufi master. And the body, or the body of the Sufi master, is later brought to Samarkand, and the name of Guri Emir, so we are saying now Guri Emir, so the mausoleum of the Emir related to Timur as being the military Emir, but actually the most popular name of the same mausoleum until the 17th century is Guri Mir, so the mausoleum of the Sufi Mir, Sayyid Baraka. And I'm saying that in the case of the monuments, we have standing monuments in Samarkand from the late 14th century, there is a connection between the Timurid patronage and the Sufis that are buried there. The same is valid also for the Yesavi shrine in Turkestan. I am personally not convinced that it was built in the first half of the 14th century. I think the construction, given the size and the decoration of the shrine, continues until the mid-15th century, but we have definitely a patronage of Sufi shrines under the Timurids, and that's very clear in the remains, architectural evidence we have. So that's why I presented this slide, because when we talk about the pairing of the madrasa and the hanka, that starts early on. It starts in Anatolia. I mean, it starts during the Mongol conquest. But here in Central Asia, it receives royal patronage. Ulugh creates a hanka and a madrasa at Registan, and Gure Emir, the essence of Gure Emir, is actually the madrasa and hanka kosh built by Muhammad Sultan. And this is, and Pletnev, one of the architectural historians who had most intimate knowledge of the complex, asserts that actually the hanka was the first building that defined the positioning of the whole complex. The hanka was most likely from the 9th century. That's according to Pletnev. Again, at the moment, there is a lot of work taking place just outside of the hanka, so I don't know whether they'll be able to discover any more evidence about the origin of the building. But I do sincerely believe that the combination of a royal madrasa and a Sufi hanka is extremely important for understanding, this pairing of buildings, for understanding the architectural heritage of the Timurids.
I completely agree, and I'm not coming to argue with that. I'm just saying, it's a small matter within a much larger thesis of yours. But the question is, when we look back at the beginnings of Mongol conversion around 1300, it's well written in the literature, and I can attest that. I've been writing about that myself. But I think that the Sufis, again, are one agent, particularly, at least in Iran proper. Central Asia, the Golden Horde, maybe different matters altogether. But in northwestern Iran, where the Mongols are concentrated, I do wonder if, I won't say I do wonder, I'm convinced that the Sufis were only part of the deal of this whole process of conversion to Islam, and later apparently become more and more important. And I think, therefore, modern researchers tend to read back what was going on later to an earlier formative period. That was my point.
Thank you. I think there is another question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a virtuosic journey, combining all these centuries and then the Soviet influence. It is really unbelievable. So I learned a lot. A few more thoughts about these issues of Sufism, but from a different angle. From hearing about this Timurid period, we can get the impression that the Sufism and the regime is completely incorporated. And it's also incorporated in the architecture that you show us in Samarkand. And maybe to some degree, this is the situation in Samarkand. But I would ask if it's not a little bit more tricky. And Sufism is sometimes incorporated, but sometimes it's also a little bit outside and having a power by itself. So if you compare it to Bukhara, and then you see the Naqshbandi complex, which is completely outside, and you compare the Bukhara city and the Naqshbandi complex, and you see the huge difference between this model and the Samarkandi model. If you go to Kashgar, for example, and you see that there is some tension again, or some dialectic between some shrines, sites of pilgrimage, which are in the periphery of the city, and the main city, the markets, the regime, what symbolizes the regime. So I think, and I wonder, I don't know enough if there are other places in the peripheries of Samarkand and what's going on there. So this is one remark regarding this kind of description. If you concentrate only in Samarkand, this is the picture you get. But if you take a zoom out, you get something a little bit more dialectic regarding both the architecture and the question of power between the Sufis and the regimes. And second, regarding, you started interestingly saying that in the 19th century there is some shift between pilgrimage and tourism. And then your last sentence was about the continuous patterns of pilgrimage today. And I completely agree, but I just want to share with you my own observation, visiting many times in Samarkand, is that somehow what's going on in Shahizinda is different from other places. And today, hence today, the situation is quite different. And it also requires a different kind of control in Shahizinda. Because again, if we go back to my first remark, even today, the relations are a little bit more dialectic. Some Sufis are under the state. Some Sufis were expelled in the last 20 years from Uzbekistan to Kazakhstan, for example, and probably you know more about it than me. So again, a little bit more dialectic, I would say, and it will be interesting to see it also in the architecture. While in Samarkand, we'll see it only as coming together.
Thank you very much for all these observations. So I will start with Shahizinda, okay? Indeed, there is a difference in the official administration of these different buildings. So Registan Square is under the Ministry of Culture, but Shahizinda falls under the Islamic Board, so the organization that monitors the Islamic practice in Uzbekistan. And the Imam of Samarkand is in charge of Shahizinda. That's why the sons of the Imam of Samarkand have these shops in Shahizinda that are selling tourist paraphernalia. They're allowed to do that. So Shahizinda is a very important site in across Central Asia, and pilgrimage to Shahizinda has been ongoing. And probably by far the largest number of pilgrims that visit Samarkand go to Shahizinda. The Sufi architecture of Samarkand is absolutely not confined to the examples that I showed. We have the whole complex of Hoja Ahrar, and we have also Sufi monuments that are outside of this inner Timurid city. I just wanted to show the early examples we have of Timurid mausoleums and contest the idea of monumentality, because I don't think it was there. Timurid connectivity to Sufi shrines goes far away, or is very deep, and goes beyond the shrine of Bahauddin Naqshbandi outside of Samarkand. Ulugh, who is this governor for 40 years in Samarkand, builds 3 madrasas during his reign. The largest one is on Registan Square in a kosh with a hanka. The hanka was destroyed. We know there was a dome, but we know nothing about its scale or dimensions. The smallest of the second madrasa is in Bukhara, and the smallest of the madrasa he built is in Gishduvan. In Gishduvan, I don't know whether you've been there, but there is a whole complex of 2 even madrasa by Ulugh that is in a kosh with a dahma of one of the founders of the Naqshbandiya order. So actually, the building for the Naqshbandiya starts with the Timurids, with Ulugh in Gishduvan, before the shrine of Bahauddin Naqshband is being built outside of Samarkand. And in Bukhara, we also have, later on, starting with Hoja Ahrar and continuing with the Jubari Sheikhs in Bukhara, we have this enormous concentration of economic power. the period that I discussed here, the late 14th century, we don't have this economic power, not yet. We have religious power that is attuned also and starts to be intertwined with political power, but the economic might of the Sufi sheikhs in Samarkand starts with Hoja Akhra and later on continues in Bukhara with the Jubairi sheikhs and the whole neighborhood. The whole avenue is outlined and marked with kosh buildings. So this main road that symbolizes economic power in Bukhara as a result of Sufi authority is also characterized by these kosh buildings. And I'm saying that the kosh ensembles are characteristic of the period, have definitely a Sufi connection, because usually one of the first buildings is a hanka and then we have a madrasa, and this signifies the gradual increase of political and economic power of the Sufis in this region. I'm not saying that we should look at this from the same perspective, and definitely not in the present moment where we have very scattered information about the history of the buildings. We, in the majority of cases, don't have endowment deeds, and what we see, the material fabric of the monuments, is something that has been, as I showed, totally transformed in a series of restoration, if you can call this restoration at all, campaigns. So it's a very complex, I think, matter to study Sufi shrines in Central Asia, because there is not a single pattern. And we have to look at the ruler. We have to look at the period, the economic power, the political power. I mean, you're absolutely right that we shouldn't approach them in a similar way. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I wholeheartedly join all the compliments that were already said before. It was a really fascinating talk. My question is mostly about accessibility and barriers that were embedded into the architecture of those structures, but also into the pilgrimage itself. You mentioned that the cenotaph of Khutam Ibn Abbas wasn't accessible to the pilgrims.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's something unique, or is it a pattern that reoccurs in other monuments as well? If it's something that is typical of the Karahanid period, or is it something that changes in the Timurid period in terms of the accessibility to the cenotaphs themselves? And if that can also be something we should take into consideration when thinking about the mobile cenotaphs of Gur Emir. And more generally, I think how much freedom people had when approaching those monuments.
Thank you. That's a very good question. The thing with cenotaphs, so we have two things. We have the actual burial, which is usually in a crypt that is not accessible for the public, and this is what we call the gurkhane, where the actual body is buried. And probably I should go to Gur Emir and show exactly, sorry about the scrolling so quickly, how this is enacted in practice. And the whole idea is that the sanctity of the dead shouldn't be disturbed. So that's why the actual body is buried in a crypt. Here we see the tombstones of the Timurid family. Muhammad Sultan, the founder of this Madrasa Sufi Khanka complex, doesn't have a tombstone. We don't know where his tombstone is. And then, in order to allow the pilgrims to pay their respects to the person who is buried in the crypt, we have the Ziyarat Khana, the actual pilgrimage place, in which we have cenotaphs. And these cenotaphs, they're simply stones commemorating the person who's buried in the crypt. And as you can see here in Gur Emir, the cenotaphs, so this would have been Ulugh and this would have been Shahruh, have also been changed in the course of time. I mean, these were erected after 1996. These are not the original cenotaphs, and we're missing here tombstone. So this is also something that changes, and we don't know exactly how. But in Sufi tradition, The Sufis are not buried underground. They're buried in a dahma. And that's why the Gishduvan complex is very interesting from a social history perspective, in which the Gishduvani was buried in a dahma, open like Bahauddin Naqshband, under the sky. This is also how Hoja Akbar is buried. And there is no mausoleum on top of the Sufi. There is no domed structure. That's why I think it's very interesting that we have these mausoleums in Samarkand in the early Timurid period, because Sufis shouldn't be buried in mausoleums. They should be buried in a hazira, in an open courtyard. Sorry. With a dahma, in which people, the pilgrims, will have circumambulations and will pay their respects and will pray. And the complex in Gishduvan, where the Ulugh Madrasa was erected, was reconstructed in the early years after independence with the mausoleum. And then this was in total contrast to the original burial in a dahma. And then the whole complex was refurbished and is now simply a hazira, which is a kind of walled space with a platform where the actual Sufi sheikh is buried. So these are two differences in how to bury a Sufi and how to bury, a ruler. Also, if we have a mausoleum, we don't necessarily have a crypt in the Islamic mausoleums. One of the earliest example of surviving standing mausoleum is the Samanid mausoleum in Bukhara, where you don't have a crypt. It's a completely different question how Islamic is the Samanid mausoleum, because actually it looks like a Chartak, it looks like a Zoroastrian fire temple. But we can also have Islamic mausoleums without the crypt. So it depends on who is buried, and it depends on how the structure of the mausoleum is created, with a crypt or without a crypt.
Thank you very much once more for the wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.